The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Special Agent Robert Harris leaned back in his well-worn chair, his tired hands spreading out a collection of manila folders across his desk. The clock on his office wall showed 9:47 p.m., but the passing of time had lost its significance in the past few weeks. The San Francisco field office had been empty for hours, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the damning evidence before him. He picked up a photograph of a young woman, no older than 20, her expression peaceful in death. Emily Carter. The official report labeled it an accidental overdose, but Robert's instincts told him otherwise. After 25 years with the Bureau's Human Trafficking Task Force, he had learned to trust his gut when things didn't add up. "You deserved better," he murmured, tracing the edge of the photograph. The girl had done everything right, escaped her captors and sought protection from the San Francisco PD, specifically Detective Owen Marshall. 48 hours later, she was dead. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke his focus. His partner, Special Agent Diane Brooks, appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Still here?" she noted, placing 1 cup on his desk. Steam curled upward from the cup, carrying the aroma of the premium coffee she always chose. "Find anything?" Robert motioned toward the timeline on his office wall. Red strings connected photos, reports, and clippings spanning 2 decades. "It's not just Emily. Look at the pattern." Diane stepped closer to the wall, her sharp eyes scanning the evidence. "Every one of these victims came through Marshall's precinct, and all of them died within days of contacting law enforcement," she observed. "Overdoses, suicides, accidents. Neat and tidy explanations." "Too neat." "Have you talked to Maya about this?" she asked, referencing Robert's wife. "She might have some insight from her liaison work." Robert's jaw tightened. "She thinks I'm seeing conspiracies where there are none. Keeps urging me to focus on retiring in a few months." A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Robert's twins, Nathan and Sarah, stood in the doorway, still wearing their detective uniforms. Their visit was unusual. They rarely came to his office. "Dad," Sarah began, her voice laced with a concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom sent us. She's worried." Nathan stepped forward, his stance echoing his sister's. "This investigation is drawing attention. The department has protocols for handling these cases, and you're overstepping." Robert studied their faces. When had his children, typically indifferent to his work, grown so invested in departmental politics? "Since when do you two care about protocol?" he asked evenly. "I remember when you thought rules were meant to be bent." Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Nathan. "We've matured. We understand how the system works now." "The system," Robert repeated, noticing how Sarah's hand moved unconsciously toward her badge. "Or the people running it?" "You're retiring in 3 months, Dad," Nathan cut in. "Why stir things up now? These cases are complicated. Sometimes it's better to leave things as they are." Diane observed the exchange silently, her seasoned instincts catching the unspoken tension. The twins stood too close, their body language defensive. Robert remained calm, but she could tell his mind was racing. "Mom put you up to this?" Robert asked, though it was more a statement than a question. "She's concerned," Sarah replied. "We all are. You've had an incredible career. Don't risk it over this." Robert turned back to his evidence wall, his voice steady but resolute. 23 women died after reaching out for help. They deserve justice. If that tarnishes my career, so be it. "You're being reckless," Nathan snapped, a rare flash of anger in his tone. "This isn't your burden to bear." "Every victim matters to me," Robert said, turning to face his children. "That's what you both used to believe too." "What changed?" Nathan and Sarah shifted uneasily, their movements almost synchronized. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Nathan placed a hand on her arm, a silent signal. "We should go," he said. "Just think about what we said, Dad. Please." Robert watched them leave, their footsteps fading down the hallway. Diane waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. "That was interesting," she remarked, sipping her coffee. "Since when do they team up on you about cases?" Robert picked up Emily Carter's photograph again, staring at it intently. "Since this case started pointing toward their precinct. Since I started digging into Marshall." "You think there's a connection?" Diane asked. "I think," Robert said slowly, that my kids have never shown this much interest in my career before. I think my wife's sudden push for me to retire is suspiciously well-timed. And I think Detective Marshall's name keeps coming up in ways that don't. Sit right with me. Diane approached the evidence wall, tracing a red string from Emily's photograph to another victim. Want me to look into the twins' recent cases? Robert nodded, his face set in a grim expression. Quietly, something isn't adding up here, Diane. I can feel it. His phone buzzed, interrupting the moment. A text from Maya? Coming home soon? We need to talk about your retirement party. Robert stared at the message, then at the wall of victims. 23 women who thought they'd found safety, only to meet suspicious ends. His instincts told him this case would be his last, but not for the reasons his family seemed to think. Go home, Diane urged softly. Get some rest. We'll tackle this tomorrow. Robert shrugged on his coat, his mind already planning the next steps. As he left, Emily's photograph seemed to watch him, her eyes holding secrets he was determined to uncover, no matter the cost. The next morning, as Robert stepped off the elevator, Assistant Director Byron Harris's secretary intercepted him, her usual composure replaced by urgency. Agent Harris, Director Harris needs you immediately. Secure conference room B. Robert checked his watch, 7:30 a.m. Harris rarely came in before. 9, this couldn't wait. The secure conference room buzzed with advanced counter-surveillance technology. Harris stood at the window, his shoulders tense beneath his meticulously tailored suit. He didn't turn as Robert entered. Close the door, he ordered gravely. What I'm about to show you stays in this room. Robert shut the door, his eyes moving to the table stacked with aged files, their edges worn and labels faded. Beside them, a laptop displayed what appeared to be DNA analysis results. You've been investigating Detective Marshall, Harris said, finally turning to face him. Why? Robert measured his response. Patterns. Too many trafficking victims dying in protective custody, all tied to his precinct. Harris nodded, his expression unreadable. Do you remember the Gateway serial killings? Early 90s, Robert replied automatically. Runaways, mostly young women, strangled with wire or cord. Task Force worked it for years, but never found the killer. He paused, a realization dawning. Marshall was part of that task force. Not just part of it, Harris corrected, sliding over a yellowed newspaper clipping. He let it. Rookie detective makes good. Becomes the face of the investigation. The press loved him. Robert studied the photograph, a younger Owen Marshall standing at a podium, his expression earnest and determined. Behind him, barely visible in the crowd, stood a familiar figure. Is that your wife? Harris asked, finishing the thought. Yes, Robert said quietly. She was working with victims' families back then. That's how she met Marshall. Robert's mind raced, piecing together timelines. Maya had been pregnant with the twins during that period. He had been away frequently, working cases in neighboring states. Harris tapped the laptop screen, which displayed DNA results. New technology matched 3 of your trafficking victims to the Gateway cases. Same killer, same signature. And here's where it gets complicated. All these victims passed through Marshall's precinct before disappearing. Jesus, Robert muttered, the implications hitting him hard. You think Marshall, I think, Harris interrupted, that we need to be very careful how we proceed. This goes beyond one corrupt officer. The Gateway Task Force had access to evidence, controlled the narrative. If Marshall was involved, he had help. Inside the department, Robert finished. Exactly, Harris confirmed, pulling out another file stamped with high-security clearance. We've been monitoring certain officers. The patterns are consistent, organized, professional. Robert thought about his children's sudden interest in his investigation. How high does this go? High. Enough that I'm assembling a joint task force with internal affairs, Harris said. But we need to tread carefully. These people have had decades to build their network and cover their tracks. A knock at the door startled them both. Harris's secretary entered, her face pale. Sir, Dr. Tina Page is here. She says it's about the Gateway cases. Robert recognized the name immediately. She had been the forensic psychologist on the original investigation. Harris's expression darkened. Send her to the secure facility on Jackson Street. Agent Harris will meet her there in an hour. After the secretary left, Harris turned back to Robert, his voice low. Paige tried to raise concerns about Marshall back then. Nobody listened. A week later, her daughter barely survived a hit and run. She took a sabbatical, moved across the country, and now she's back. Why now? Robert asked. That's what you're going to find out, Harris replied, securing the files in a classified pouch. But watch your back. These people have been hiding in plain sight for years. They won't go down easily. Robert thought of Emily Carter, the other victims, his wife's insistence on his retirement, and his children's peculiar behavior. 25 years of marriage, and he'd never questioned why Maya had pushed so hard for the twins to join law enforcement under Marshall's guidance. Sir, Robert said, pausing at the door. If this goes where I think we'll handle that when the time comes, Harris interrupted. For now, focus on Dr. Page. Whatever brought her back, it's important. Robert nodded, already planning his next move. As he left, he couldn't shake the feeling that his final case was about to become deeply personal. The FBI's secure facility on Jackson Street looked abandoned from the outside, a deliberate facade. Robert parked 2 blocks away, taking a circuitous route on foot, scanning for surveillance out of habit. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between buildings, perfect for staying unnoticed. Dr. Tina Page waited in interview room C. She looked markedly different from the confident professional in the old case photos. Her hair was entirely gray, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged a thick file on the table. Agent Harris, she greeted, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for meeting me. I've been following your work on the trafficking cases. Robert sat across from her, noting her laptop's advanced encryption setup and multiple authentication devices. You've been gathering evidence, he said, more a statement than a question. She nodded. For years. After they threatened my family, I couldn't stop, but I had to be smarter. Create safeguards. They? Robert prompted. Marshall. His network, she replied, opening her file to reveal meticulous notes and photographs. During the Gateway investigation, I started noticing inconsistencies. Witnesses whose statements changed after meeting him. Evidence that disappeared. Patterns in his reports. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Robert asked. Tina laughed bitterly. I did. The day after I raised concerns, my daughter was nearly killed in a hit and run. The driver was never found, but the message was clear. She slid a photograph across the table. A teenage girl in a hospital bed, her body covered in casts. Emily was 13. She still walks with a limp. I'm sorry, Robert said softly, but something made you decide to come forward now. Tina's gaze locked with his for the first time. Your wife, she said. When I saw her name connected to recent trafficking cases, I couldn't stay silent. Robert felt a chill despite the room's warmth. What about my wife? Tina's hands trembled as she pulled out another file. During the Gateway investigation, Maya worked closely with the task force. She had access to victim profiles, family interviews, witness statements. At first, I thought she was just committed to the job, staying late, taking files home. But then I noticed discrepancies in the cases she handled. Witness statements that contradicted earlier versions. Evidence logs that didn't match up. She passed him surveillance photos of Maya meeting Marshall in out-of-the-way locations. When I started documenting these anomalies, she gestured to her daughter's photograph. You know what happened? Robert's throat went dry. When did you first suspect? He hesitated, the question forming painfully. That she was working with Marshall? Or that she was carrying his children? The words hit Robert like a physical blow. He stared at Tina, unable to speak. I'm sorry, she said gently. I thought when she announced her pregnancy, you knew. She was working so closely with the task force, and you were away so often. The timing. Robert's mind raced through memories. Maya's strange behavior during the pregnancy, chalked up to work stress. Her insistence that the twins follow Marshall into law enforcement. Their uncanny resemblance to the detective, dismissed as mere coincidence. Why come forward now? He finally managed. Tina opened her laptop, typing quickly. Because history is repeating itself. The trafficking victims you're investigating, their deaths mirror the Gateway killings. Same methods, same cover-ups. But this time, she turned the screen toward him. This time I have proof. The screen displayed financial records, surveillance photos, transcribed phone conversations. Years of meticulously gathered evidence connecting Marshall to both the original murders and the recent trafficking deaths. Maya's been using her role as liaison to identify potential witnesses, Tina explained. When victims seek protection, she ensures they're routed to Marshall's precinct. After that, she gestured toward the victim photos on Robert's evidence wall. The twins, Robert said suddenly. Do they know? Tina's expression softened, filled with sympathy. I don't know, but their recent case assignments all involve potential trafficking witnesses. Witnesses who later died in custody or vanished. Robert thought of his children's recent visit to his office, their plea for him to drop the investigation. Had they known what they were truly protecting? I've arranged for all this evidence to be disseminated to multiple sources if anything happens to me, Tina continued. Offshore servers, dead man switches. I learned from last time, but you need to be careful, Agent Harris. These people, they've spent decades perfecting their operation. They won't hesitate to eliminate threats. Even family? Robert asked, though he already knew the answer. Especially family, Tina replied. They use those connections, exploit them. Your position in the FBI, your children's roles in the department. It's all part of their protective network. Robert stood, needing to move. 25 years of marriage, built on deception. His children, not truly his, potentially complicit in murder cover-ups. An entire life based on lies. I need to know everything, he said finally, sitting down again. Tina nodded, pulling out additional documents. It started with the first gateway victim in '94. Holly Martinez, 16, a runaway. She contacted Marshall, claiming she had information about a trafficking ring operating in San Francisco. 2 days later, she was found strangled. She laid out photos in chronological order, young faces all bearing identical ligature marks. The pattern was always the same. Victims would approach law enforcement with trafficking intel. Marshall would take charge of their protection. Within days, they'd be dead. And Maya's role? Robert asked. At first, she was just like me, Tina said, hesitating, trying to help victims. But she paused, choosing her words. He has a talent for identifying people he can manipulate. He saw something in Maya, ambition, maybe, or vulnerability. He started grooming her, sharing case details, making her feel special. Robert remembered those early days. Maya's enthusiasm for her work, her admiration for the dedicated detective leading the Gateway Task Force. How had he been so blind? By the time she understood what was happening, she was already compromised, Tina continued. And then she got pregnant. For Marshall, it was an opportunity to secure loyalty and embed his own influence in law enforcement. The twins, Robert muttered. He planned it from the start. They were raised to idolize him, Tina confirmed. Uncle Owen, who guided their careers, shaped their assignments. The perfect cover. Who would suspect a decorated detective mentoring his colleagues' children? A chilling thought struck Robert. The recent trafficking victims, Emily Carter and the others, were they close to exposing something? Tina's expression turned grim. They weren't just random victims, Agent Harris. They were starting to connect the present to the past. Emily especially. She had evidence linking current trafficking operations to the Gateway killings. Evidence that could have unraveled decades of corruption. Tina pulled up another file on her laptop, showing surveillance photos of Emily meeting with various officers, including Nathan and Sarah. Your children were assigned to her protective detail. Whether they knew it or not, they delivered her straight to Marshall. Robert felt a wave of nausea. His twins, he still thought of them as his children. Had they knowingly participated in a murder? Or were they simply pawns in Marshall's game? Just as he had been? There's more, Tina said softly. Your retirement party next month. It's not just a celebration. Robert recalled Maya's insistence on hosting it at the Police Officers Association building, her meticulous handling of the guest list. They're planning something, Tina confirmed. They see you're getting too close, asking too many questions. They can't risk you continuing this investigation after retirement. She hesitated. And Maya? She's been meeting with Marshall more frequently over the past month. Tina's hands trembled as she shut her laptop. Whatever's happening, they're nervous. You need to be careful. They've spent decades perfecting their methods. Robert thought of his office wall, the victim photos and connections he'd been piecing together. How many times had Maya been in his office, seen what he was working on? How much had she reported back to Marshall? What do you recommend? He asked. Work with your task force, but trust no one outside it, Tina advised. Marshall has people everywhere, police, judiciary, even federal agencies. Assume everyone's compromised until proven otherwise. She handed him a small, encrypted drive. Everything I've collected is here. Evidence, connections, patterns. But be cautious how you use it. Once they realize what you know, they'll act against you, Robert said, finishing her thought. Maybe they already are? His phone buzzed. A text from Maya. Finalizing the guest list for the retirement party. Need to discuss security arrangements. Tina saw his expression and sighed. Thank you, Dr. Page. For everything, Robert said. I'll need time to process this. At the door, Tina hesitated. Just remember, they're not just criminals, Agent Harris. They're family. That makes them more dangerous, not less. Robert watched her leave, thinking of Emily Carter, of all the other victims, of Maya's recent fixation on his retirement plans, and his children's pressure to drop the investigation. Family secrets, he realized, could be the deadliest kind. Outside, the sun had set, casting San Francisco's skyline in shadows. Robert sat alone in the interview room, the weight of 25 years of lies crushing him. His final case had turned into a race against time, not just to expose a criminal enterprise, but to survive his family's betrayal. The San Francisco Police Officers Association building loomed against the late afternoon sky, its weathered facade a testament to decades of Bay Area winters. Special Agent Diane Brooks adjusted her earpiece for the third time in as many minutes, monitoring unmarked vehicles taking positions around the perimeter. All units in position, crackled a voice in her ear. Awaiting your signal. From her surveillance van across the street, Diane watched guests arrive for Robert Harris's retirement party. Each face was quietly confirmed by her team. Officers from Internal Affairs, FBI agents, and carefully vetted members of the San Francisco PD's anti-corruption unit. Target vehicle approaching, another voice reported. Black SUV, diplomatic plates. Diane's eyes followed Marshall's vehicle as it pulled into a reserved space. He emerged, the image of a decorated officer, silver hair immaculate, uniform pristine, medals gleaming. Few would suspect the sinister truth hidden beneath the polished exterior. I have visual on the twins, her partner said. Through the monitors, Diane watched Nathan and Sarah Harris greeting guests at the entrance. Their smiles seemed genuine, but their eyes constantly scanned the crowd, a behavior Diane had noted during countless surveillance operations. Her phone buzzed, a text from Robert. Maya insisted on handling the arrangements herself. She's playing right into our hands. The past 3 months had been a meticulous game of deception. After Tina's revelations, Robert had approached Diane with a plan so bold it bordered on reckless. Instead of confronting Maya and the twins immediately, they would use his retirement party to expose the entire network. It's perfect, Robert had explained during one of their covert meetings. They think they're setting a trap for me, but we're actually gathering all their co-conspirators in one place. The operation required extraordinary precision. Working with Internal Affairs, they had embedded undercover agents across the department, meticulously gathering evidence that connected Marshall's trafficking operation to his network of corrupt officers. Every piece of evidence was cataloged, and every witness statement safeguarded through multiple layers of security. Diane's team had uncovered that Marshall wasn't just covering up crimes. He was orchestrating a sophisticated trafficking operation, using his position within the San Francisco PD to safeguard routes through the city. His reach extended across precincts, with officers on his payroll ensuring witnesses either disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. Through her earpiece, Diane heard the party getting underway. Robert's voice came clearly through his hidden microphone. I'm overwhelmed by the turnout. 25 years with the Bureau, and I never expected. Cut the modesty, darling, Maya's voice interrupted. Diane noted how Maya kept one hand firmly on Robert's arm, playing the role of proud wife. You deserve every bit of recognition. On the monitors, Marshall moved through the room, laughing with officers, shaking hands, and basking in the admiration of his peers. The twins shadowed Robert like satellites, their movements so synchronized they appeared choreographed. Package secured, came a whisper through Diane's earpiece. In the building's basement, a technical team had completed setting up the presentation that would expose everything: surveillance footage, financial records, DNA evidence tying Marshall to both the Gateway killings and recent trafficking victims. Diane checked her watch. 1 hour until the tribute presentation. 1 hour until years of careful investigation came to light. 1 hour until Robert's world publicly unraveled, though she knew his real reckoning had begun months ago with Dr. Page's revelations. Through the monitors, she watched Maya approach the podium, champagne glass in hand. Her confidence was striking. She truly believed this was her moment of triumph, her chance to humiliate the man she had deceived for 25 years. Remember, Diane spoke softly into her comm unit. We wait for the signal. No one moves until Robert gives the word. She thought back to the day Robert first shared his suspicions about the trafficking victims' deaths. How many lives could have been saved if they'd uncovered this conspiracy sooner? How many young women had disappeared into Marshall's network, while others turned a blind eye? The party continued inside, a meticulously curated facade of celebration, masking the tension beneath the surface. Diane watched Robert move among the guests, shaking hands and receiving congratulations, playing his role flawlessly. Only someone who truly knew him would notice the sharpness in his eyes, the calculated way he kept both Marshall and the twins within view. Director Harris has arrived, came another update. All principals are in play. Diane nodded even though no one could see her. Everything was proceeding according to plan, yet her instincts warned her. The operation seemed almost too perfect, too seamless. In her experience, the most dangerous moments came when everything appeared to be going exactly as planned. She keyed her microphone. All units, maintain positions. Stay alert for any deviations. Through the monitors, she saw the pieces of their trap falling into place, silently hoping they hadn't underestimated their adversaries. Marshall and his network had managed to evade detection for decades. People that clever, that patient were capable of anything. The next hour would either expose decades of corruption or end catastrophically. Somewhere in the building, Robert prepared to confront the moment his family's betrayal became public knowledge. Diane touched her sidearm, a reflex honed by years in the field. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't let Robert face it alone. The reception hall of the Police Officers Association building buzzed with conversation and laughter, a carefully staged atmosphere disguising the tension beneath. Robert stood near the bar, watching the room's reflection in the mirrored wall behind the bottles. Every face held new meaning now. Who among them were complicit in Marshall's network, and who were unknowing participants like he had been? Maya appeared at his side, her familiar perfume suddenly overwhelming. Time for the special presentation, darling, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Clay has something wonderful planned. Robert let her guide him toward the front, noting how she positioned herself between him and the nearest exit. Behind them, Marshall took the stage, his presence commanding the room. Friends, colleagues, family, Marshall began, his voice warm and deceptively inviting. We're here tonight to honor a man who's dedicated 25 years to justice, who's been a partner to the San Francisco PD in countless investigations. He paused, his gaze locking on Robert, and who's been like a father to my finest officers. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Robert felt Maya's grip tighten on his arm, her nails digging through his jacket. Across the room, Nathan and Sarah moved to flank the exits. Oh yes, Marshall continued, his congenial mask slipping. I think it's time we acknowledge some family secrets. Don't you, Maya? Robert's wife released his arm and walked toward the stage with deliberate confidence. Gone was the nervous energy of recent months, replaced by a cold assurance he'd never seen before. 25 years of marriage, 2 children, and only now did the truth come to light. You were always so busy with your cases, Robert, Maya said, her voice cutting as she perched herself on Marshall's chair. So dedicated to justice. Did you ever wonder why I insisted the twins follow? Clay's career path. Nathan and Sarah stepped forward, holding their badges high. The synchronized movement Robert had found so unsettling now made perfect sense. They'd been practicing it their entire lives. Blood is thicker than your pension, old man, Nathan called out. You were good for paying the bills. Now you're nothing to us. Robert allowed his shoulders to slump, feigning defeat. He felt the discomfort radiating from the crowd. This was the humiliation Maya and Marshall had planned, his reputation destroyed before his peers. Nothing to say? Marshall taunted, his grin mocking. The great FBI agent, speechless at last, Robert straightened slowly, locking eyes with Marshall. Actually, I do have something to say. His voice rang clearly through the room's sudden silence. Let me tell you a secret. Your real daddy has been under investigation for murder, and you loyal kids just helped me crack the case. The smug expression froze on Marshall's face. Maya started to rise, but Robert's next words froze her in place. Director Harris, I believe we're ready for that evidence presentation now. Before anyone could react, every screen in the room lit up. Diane Brooks's team had done their work flawlessly. The footage was sharp, the evidence irrefutable. Surveillance showed Marshall meeting with known trafficking operators. Financial records detailed payments to corrupt officers. DNA evidence conclusively tied him to both the Gateway killings and recent trafficking victims. You see, Robert continued, his voice calm and unwavering. While you were busy planning my retirement party, I was building a case. Every meeting you held, every call you made, every victim you silenced. We were watching, recording, gathering the evidence that would dismantle not just you, but your entire network. Maya's face drained of color. You couldn't. You didn't. Oh, but I did, Robert replied. I've known since Dr. Page came forward. Everything since then has been part of a plan, right down to this moment. Marshall surged to his feet, reaching for his weapon, but found himself surrounded by agents disguised as waitstaff. Around the room, more undercover operatives revealed themselves, weapons drawn. It's over, Owen, Robert said quietly. The trafficking routes, the Gateway killings, the decades of corruption. All of it ends tonight. Nathan and Sarah tried to head for the exits, only to find their paths blocked by internal affairs officers. Their expressions shifted from confusion to horror as evidence appeared on the screens, detailing their unwitting role in delivering victims to Marshall's operation. You used your own children, Robert said, his voice heavy with disdain. Raised them to be unwitting accomplices in your crimes. What kind of father does that? The kind who knows how to inspire loyalty, Marshall snarled, though his confidence wavered. His eyes darted around the room, calculating odds, counting weapons. Loyalty? Robert laughed bitterly. Look around, Owen. Your so-called loyal officers are already turning on you. See how fast they're dropping their weapons, raising their hands? They know what's coming. Federal charges, RICO indictments, conspiracy to commit murder. Who do you think will stay loyal when facing life in prison? Maya made a sudden move toward her purse, but Diane was faster. I wouldn't, she warned, her weapon steady. That recording device you're reaching for? We already have copies of everything on it, including your discussions about silencing Emily Carter. The mention of Emily's name sent a visible shiver through the room. Many officers had known her, had watched her die in protective custody. Now they understood why. You really think this will stick? Marshall's voice dripped with contempt. I've beaten investigations before. My contacts, your contacts are being arrested. As we speak, Robert interrupted. While you were here, federal agents executed warrants across 3 states. Your entire network is crumbling, Owen. The only question is who will cooperate first for leniency. Nathan and Sarah stood frozen, their world collapsing around them. Sarah broke the silence, her voice cracking. Dad, we didn't know about the trafficking, the murders we thought. You thought you were following in your father's footsteps, Robert said gently. And in a way, you were, just not the father you thought you were honoring. The screens around the reception hall cast the room in a cold, electronic glow as Diane methodically presented the evidence. Each new revelation drew gasps and murmurs from the assembled officers. many only now grasping the scale of the corruption they had unwittingly been part of. Surveillance footage from March 15th, Diane narrated as clear video played. Detective Marshall meeting known trafficking operators at the port of San Francisco. The timestamp matched shipping manifests displayed alongside. Manifests showed cargo containers that had passed through customs without inspection. Financial records spanning 2 decades, Diane continued. Another screen filled with detailed transaction data. Payments routed through shell companies, offshore accounts, all traced back to entities controlled by members of the department. Robert watched Maya's face as the evidence piled up. She sat rigid, flanked by federal agents, her carefully maintained composure unraveling with each new piece of proof. Every lie, every betrayal, every crime was laid bare, and the life she had constructed so meticulously collapsed around her. The woman he'd loved for 25 years was now a stranger to him. Most damning are the recordings, Diane continued, activating another screen. Maya's voice filled the room, calm and methodical, as she discussed the disposal of potential witnesses with Marshall. The timestamps were recent, conversations about Emily Carter and other trafficking victims who had died in custody. You'll notice, Diane pointed out, how these conversations align perfectly with case files from Detective Marshall's precinct. Each victim who sought protection was systematically isolated, their statements altered or destroyed before they met with tragic accidents. The technical team had done an exceptional job, creating visual timelines that revealed the evolving pattern of corruption over the years. Red lines connected victims to officers, officers to payments, and payments to trafficking operations. At the center of it all sat Marshall, his influence spreading like a cancer through the department. The Gateway serial killings weren't just unsolved cases. Robert took over the presentation, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. They were the foundation of this entire criminal enterprise. Young runaways who uncovered too much, who threatened to expose the trafficking operations, became Marshall's victims. More evidence appeared. DNA analysis linking Marshall to both the historic Gateway killings and recent trafficking victims. Dr. Page's painstaking documentation provided context, showing how the crimes had evolved from opportunistic murders to a systematic operation for silencing witnesses. Mrs. Harris, Diane addressed Maya formally. Your position as the department liaison wasn't just convenient. It was essential to the operation. She activated another recording, Maya's voice directing vulnerable witnesses away from legitimate protection and toward Marshall's precinct. You identified potential threats, Diane continued, used your position to gain their trust, and delivered them directly into the hands of their killers. All while maintaining the perfect image of a dedicated public servant. Nathan and Sarah now sat apart from their mother, their faces pale as they watched footage of themselves following Marshall's special assignments, unknowingly helping isolate and control trafficking victims who later died in custody. Nathan and Sarah Harris, Diane's voice softened slightly, were carefully positioned throughout their careers to support this operation, though evidence suggests they were unaware of its true purpose. Their assignments, supervised by Detective Marshall, consistently involved witnesses who later disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. Robert looked at his children. He couldn't help but still think of them that way, as the full weight of their unwitting involvement sank in. Sarah buried her face in her hands, while Nathan stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. The operation extended far beyond San Francisco, Diane continued, bringing up maps showing trafficking routes spanning multiple states. Detective Marshall's network included corrupt officers in neighboring jurisdictions, customs officials, and even judges in some districts, all connected through a sophisticated system of payments and blackmail. She activated a final screen, displaying a complex web of relationships and transactions. This map represents only the connections we've confirmed so far. Every line represents evidence that will stand up in federal court. Witness statements, financial records, surveillance footage, DNA evidence, and more. The room had fallen silent as the enormity of the conspiracy became clear. Officers who had worked alongside Marshall for years now saw him for what he truly was, not just a corrupt cop, but a murderer who had built an empire on human suffering. I want to be very clear, Diane's voice carried both authority and warning. This investigation is ongoing. Anyone in this room who has information about these crimes has exactly one opportunity to cooperate. After tonight, the deals come off the table. Robert watched as several officers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Marshall and the exits. The Brotherhood of Silence that had shielded this corruption for decades was cracking under the weight of federal indictments. 25 years, Robert said quietly, but in the stillness his voice carried. 25 years I investigated human trafficking while the answers were right in my own home. Every victim we couldn't save, every witness who disappeared, the truth was sitting across from me at dinner. Maya finally broke her silence, her voice cold and bitter. You were always so dedicated to your precious victims. Did you ever wonder why I stopped practicing law? Why I took that liaison position? Owen understood what truly mattered. Power, control, survival. Survival. Robert's voice cracked with disbelief. You helped murder innocent women, used our children as unwitting accomplices. For what? Money? Power? For family. Marshall interjected, his trademark confidence intact despite the handcuffs on his wrists. Something you never understood, Robert. Everything I did was to build a legacy. Those kids you're so concerned about? I gave them purpose, direction, careers. You used them. Diane cut in, bringing up more footage. Here's what real family looks like, Detective Marshall. The screen displayed a series of images. Nathan and Sarah as rookie officers, steered toward specific assignments. Surveillance photos showed Marshall overseeing their progress, carefully directing their careers with calculated precision. Each special assignment was designed to compromise them further, Diane explained to the room. Every time they unknowingly helped control or transport a witness, they became more entangled in the operation. Their own badges became their prison. Sarah looked up at this, her tear-streaked face hardening with anger. All those women, she said, her voice shaking. The ones you said needed special handling. They were trying to expose you, weren't they? And we helped. You helped protect the department, Maya snapped. Protected your father's work. Everything we did was for you kids. Stop it. Nathan exploded, standing so abruptly that his chair crashed backward. You didn't do any of this for us. You used us. Our whole lives. Everything we thought we were. It was all just part of your sick game. The evidence continued to unfold on the screens. Years of careful manipulation and calculated grooming, all designed to create the perfect cover for Marshall's operation. The twins' careers, their assignments, even their precincts, nothing had been left to chance. Diane's team had crafted a presentation that was both comprehensive and devastating. There would be no escape through legal loopholes or claimed misunderstandings. The evidence was overwhelming. We have cooperating witnesses, Diane announced, displaying a final set of documents. Officers who worked under Detective Marshall, trafficking victims who survived, family members of the Gateway victims, all ready to testify. The U.S. Attorney's Office is prepared to proceed with RICO charges, multiple counts of murder, human trafficking, and conspiracy. She continued, the list of charges hammering down like nails in the coffin of Marshall's empire. Throughout the room, officers who had once admired him now avoided his gaze. The legendary detective, mentor to generations of San Francisco cops, stood exposed as a monster who had corrupted everything he touched. As the final pieces of evidence were displayed, Robert felt a profound exhaustion settle over him. His retirement party had transformed into something else entirely, a funeral for the life he'd thought he had and the family he believed in. The screens faded to black, leaving the room in stunned silence. Decades of corruption, murder, and trafficking laid bare in a single evening. Lives destroyed, careers ruined, and at the center of it all, a family shattered beyond repair. Diane stepped forward, her voice firm and authoritative. Detective Owen Marshall, Maya Harris, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. The familiar words echoed through the hall as more agents moved in. Robert watched as his wife and her accomplice were led away in handcuffs, their empire of lies crumbling around them. Behind him, his children, victims in so many ways, sat shell-shocked amidst the ruins of everything they believed about their lives. As the arrests proceeded, Robert stood silent, watching the culmination of his carefully constructed operation. Years of corruption had been exposed, but this was only the beginning. The real work, dismantling Marshall's network and bringing every conspirator to justice, still lay ahead. The handcuffs clicked shut around Owen Marshall's wrists, the sound reverberating through the reception hall. Federal agents maintained their positions at every exit, weapons still drawn, though the immediate danger had passed. The evidence presentation that had laid bare decades of corruption still flickered on the surrounding screens, casting an accusatory glow over the officers in the room. Robert Harris stood at the center of the chaos, his retirement party transformed into the climax of a massive federal investigation. But his focus wasn't on Marshall or even Maya. His attention was fixed solely on Nathan and Sarah, who sat in stunned silence at a nearby table. "Secure the prisoner," Diane Brooks ordered, her voice firm with the authority of the Bureau. As agents moved to escort Marshall away, Robert approached his children. Everything else, the arrests, the paperwork, the inevitable media storm, could wait. This moment, this conversation had to come first. "Dad." Sarah's voice cracked on the word, the uncertainty in her tone making her sound young again. The confidence she displayed earlier, when standing with Marshall, had evaporated under the weight of irrefutable evidence. "I need you both to listen carefully," Robert said, pulling up a chair to sit across from them. Behind him, he could hear Maya being read her rights, her usual composure replaced by bitter accusations and threats. He tuned it out, focusing entirely on the two people who were as much victims as anyone else. "In this case, I've known about your paternity for months," he began, watching their faces closely, "since Dr. Page came forward with her evidence. But what you don't know, what you need to understand, is that your mother and Marshall have been using you from the start." Nathan's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "The special assignments," Robert continued, his voice gentle despite the horrifying truth he had to reveal. "Those women you were tasked with protecting? The ones Marshall said needed special handling? You were unknowingly helping traffic young women, some of them younger than you." The color drained from Sarah's face as the realization hit her. "Emily Carter," she whispered. "She kept trying to tell me something about the department, about Uncle Owen, and I." "And you reported every conversation directly to him," Robert confirmed. "Just like you were trained to do. You both did exactly what they groomed you to do. Follow orders, trust the chain of command, believe in your superiors. Those women." Nathan's voice trembled with dawning comprehension. "All those witnesses we handled, they all died in custody. Or disappeared. Every single one." Diane approached their table, a tablet in hand. "I need to show you something," she said quietly, pulling up a series of case files. "These are all the assignments you've been given over the past 5 years. Notice the pattern?" The twins leaned in, their faces illuminated by the screen. Each file showed the same trajectory. Vulnerable witnesses placed under their protection, subsequent reports noting increasingly erratic behavior, followed by final notations of death by overdose or suicide. "You were the perfect cover," Diane explained. "Second-generation officers, children of a respected FBI agent and a decorated detective, who would question your reports, who would look too closely at witnesses in your custody." Sarah pushed back abruptly, barely making it to a nearby trash can before she was violently ill. Nathan sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the damning evidence of their unwitting complicity in countless deaths. "I remember them," he said numbly. "Their faces, their stories. They were so scared. We told them they were safe. We promised them protection." Robert reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's. The fact that they weren't biologically his hadn't mattered in years. These were his children, and they were drowning in the horror of what had been done to them. "Listen to me, both of you," he said as Sarah returned, wiping her mouth with a trembling hand. "You were used, groomed from the beginning for this role. Everything, your career choices, your assignments, it was all orchestrated to make you the perfect tools for their operation." "Why?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Why would they? Our own mother." "Because it worked," Diane answered, her tone professional but laced with empathy. "Your presence legitimized everything. Suspicious deaths in custody? Just tragic accidents, verified by the impeccable Harris twins. Witnesses changing their stories? They must be truthful if they're speaking to such respected young officers. Your badges didn't just make you part of their legacy. They made you the perfect, unwitting accomplices. Through the windows, emergency lights painted the night in rotating patterns of red and blue. The sirens outside matched the chaos and devastation within, as Robert's family grappled with the magnitude of the betrayal that had shaped their lives. More law enforcement vehicles were arriving, marking the beginning of a massive operation to dismantle Marshall's network. What happens now? Nathan asked, his eyes still fixed on the case files detailing their unwitting involvement in so many deaths. That depends partly on you, Robert replied carefully. The U.S. attorneys. Office will want to talk to both of you. Everything you know about the department, about Marshall's operations, about these cases, it could be crucial to building an airtight case. They'll also want to verify that you were truly unaware, Diane added. Dr. Page's evidence supports this. Her documentation shows how carefully you were manipulated, how information was compartmentalized to keep you in the dark. But your cooperation will be essential. Sarah looked up, her tear-streaked face hardening with determination. Those women? We owe them the truth. All of it. Everything we can remember about how the cases were handled, who was involved. It won't bring them back, Nathan said hollowly. No, Robert agreed, but it might help us save others. Marshall's network extends far beyond San Francisco. There are other victims, other trafficking operations still active. Your testimony could help us shut it all down. Through the glass doors of the reception hall, they watched Marshall being led to a waiting vehicle. The once legendary detective held his head high, his bearing proud despite the handcuffs. Maya followed in the custody of other agents, her earlier bravado replaced by a cold, calculating silence. They're really going to prison, Sarah said softly, watching her mother disappear into another vehicle. Our whole lives, everything we thought we knew was a lie, Nathan finished. But what does that make us? Everything you've done as officers makes you victims of an elaborate conspiracy, Diane interjected firmly, and potentially key witnesses in dismantling it. But first, she glanced at Robert, we need your formal statements. Everything you can tell us about how Marshall operated, how cases were assigned, who else might have been involved. Robert watched his children as they processed the weight of what lay ahead. The statements, the investigations, the inevitable media scrutiny. They looked both older and younger than their years, crushed by the revelations but not entirely broken. I know it's overwhelming, he said gently, but you're not alone in this. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. The twins exchanged a look, a silent communication honed over a lifetime. Then Sarah straightened her shoulders, a flicker of the confident officer she had been just hours before. Where do we start? The following weeks unfolded in a blur of depositions, evidence reviews, and increasingly shocking revelations. The conference room at the federal building became their second home, its walls covered with timeline. Charts and connection maps growing more intricate by the day. Robert sat beside Diane, watching as Sarah carefully walked the U.S. Attorney's team through another case file. Her voice, initially shaky, had grown stronger, the shock of betrayal hardening into a determination to uncover every detail of the conspiracy that had defined her life. The victim was Lisa Chun, 22, Sarah explained, pointing to a photograph. She approached me directly, claiming she had information about trafficking operations through the port of San Francisco. Following department procedure, following what Uncle Owen trained us to do, I logged her statement, but reported it directly to him. The prosecutors nodded, taking detailed notes. They had heard dozens of similar stories over the past weeks, each adding another piece to the vast criminal enterprise they were uncovering. 3 days later, Sarah continued, her voice catching slightly, she died of an apparent overdose while in protective custody. The toxicology report was signed by Dr. Marcus Webb, Diane added, marking another name on their growing list of conspirators. He signed off on several similar cases, always ruling them accidents or suicides. In another room down the hall, Nathan worked with internal affairs, methodically reviewing years of case assignments and departmental procedures. His insider knowledge of precinct operations had already identified numerous corrupt officers and compromised officials. The full story emerged piece by devastating piece. Marshall didn't start as a criminal mastermind, Robert explained to the assembled prosecutors. He began as a corrupt cop, protecting existing trafficking routes through San Francisco. But when victims threatened to expose him, he evolved into something far more dangerous. The gateway killings were his solution to potential witnesses, Sarah added bitterly. Young runaways who knew too much and couldn't be silenced through conventional means. But he needed help managing investigations and controlling evidence, Robert continued. That's where Maya came in. The word mom carried a weight of bitterness in Sarah's voice now. As a victim's advocate, she had access to witness statements, family contacts, and investigation details. She could identify threats early and steer victims away from legitimate help. Diane displayed another series of documents on the main screen. Maya Harris's position was crucial to the operation's growth. She could spot potential witnesses before they went to other authorities, ensuring they were directed to Marshall's precinct for protection. And when she became pregnant, one prosecutor added cautiously, glancing at Sarah. We were the perfect opportunity, Sarah finished grimly. A chance to place loyal officers within the department. Except that loyalty was built on lies. Dr. Page's years of meticulous documentation proved invaluable. Her record showed how Marshall systematically expanded his influence through a combination of bribes, blackmail, and strategic promotions. The seaport was key, Nathan explained, joining the group after his internal affairs session. Corrupt customs officials, dock workers on the payroll, even shipping companies complicit in trafficking. Everything looked legitimate on paper because the right people were paid to look the other way. Robert watched his children working tirelessly with the investigative teams, pride mingling with lingering sorrow. They had channeled their shock and betrayal into a relentless pursuit of justice, throwing themselves into dismantling the conspiracy with the same dedication they had once shown to their careers. Each new revelation only strengthened their resolve, rather than break them further. The hardest part, Sarah admitted during a rare quiet moment, is knowing how many people we trusted were involved. Captain Rivera, Lieutenant Shun, even Rabbi Goldman from the chaplain's office. They all played their parts. They preyed on that trust, Robert reminded her. Used your integrity against you. The investigation had expanded far. Beyond San Francisco, uncovering trafficking networks that spanned multiple states. Each new arrest led to more revelations, more connections, and more evidence of how deep the corruption had spread. Dr. Page's system of offshore servers and dead-man switches had safeguarded her evidence until it was needed. Now, that same evidence was helping prosecutors build an airtight case, not just against Marshall and Maya, but against dozens of other conspirators. It's like a cancer, Diane observed, studying their latest organizational chart. Once it started, it just kept growing, spreading through departments, jurisdictions, even state lines. But we're cutting it out, Nathan said firmly. All of it, no matter who gets exposed. The twins had proven invaluable to the investigation, their deep knowledge of department operations helping identify corrupt officers and compromised procedures. Their testimony, combined with Dr. Page's evidence, was constructing a case virtually impossible to defend against. You should know, Diane told them one evening. Your cooperation, plus the evidence showing you were unaware of the true nature of your assignments. The U.S. Attorney is considering offering you immunity. Sarah and Nathan exchanged a glance. We don't deserve special treatment, Sarah said quietly. Those women died because of us. You were victims too, Robert reminded them. Used by the people who should have protected you. Maybe, Nathan acknowledged.